In September 1941, the siege of Leningrad began. Surrounded by German and Finnish forces, the city was cut off by land. Inside, more than 2 million people faced hunger, cold, and bombings. Reserves ran out. Communications were cut. Rations decreased every week. During the first winter, temperatures reached 40 degrees below zero. Stoves went out. Bread, adulterated with flax and cotton remnants, barely reached 125 grams daily. Many died in their homes, in the streets, or in distribution queues. Morgues ran out of stretchers. Water sources froze. The city became immobile. Life did not stop, but it transformed. Some resisted. Others did not. The voices of those who were there, their diaries, letters, drawings, and stories, allow for an exact reconstruction of what was experienced, what can truly be understood about what they lived through. The siege begins, the German invasion and the fall towards Leningrad. In the early morning of June 22, 1941, signals operator Mikhail Neistat noticed intense activity on the Leningrad telegraph. Urgent messages were arriving from Red Army headquarters, urgently requesting the district military commander. As he was not present, the chief of staff was contacted, who read a telegram confirming the imminent German troops had crossed the border, initiating the offensive known as Operation Barbarossa. Marshal Timoshenko, People's Commissar for Defense at the time, ordered the deployment of troops without opening fire, reflecting the prevailing uncertainty. Shortly after, it became clear that this was not a border attack, but a military operation of enormous proportions. More than 3 million German soldiers, along with tanks and aircraft, advanced from the Black Sea to the Baltic. Adolf Hitler had planned the offensive since 1940 and justified it as a crusade against communism. The strategy, dubbed Barbarossa, was developed by Friedrich Paulus and envisioned a blitzkrieg that would dismantle the Soviet Union in weeks. Hitler did not consider the non-aggression pact signed with Stalin as lasting and, to convince the High Command, alleged an imminent Soviet attack as an excuse for the assault. Leningrad, a revolutionary and strategic symbol, was one of the main objectives. Army Group North, commanded by Ritter von Lieb, was tasked with capturing the city. His forces included Küchler's and Busch's armies, as well as panzer divisions and the SS Totenkopf. Georg von Küchler, leading the 18th Army and a staunch supporter of the Nazi regime, determinedly executed orders to exterminate Soviet political commissars through the Kommissarbefehl order. From the early days of July, German troops advanced rapidly northward. While Reinhardt and Manstein broke through the Stalin line, the Einsatzgruppen committed massacres in occupied areas, such as Kaunas, with the knowledge of the German command. The Luftwaffe destroyed retreating Soviet columns and devastated supply routes. Kliment Voroshilov, a historical figure of the communist regime but lacking adequate tactical ability, was appointed in charge of Leningrad's defense. Instead of structuring a layered defense, he opted to erect a single line on the Luga River, mobilizing civilians without training or safety conditions. Children, women, and the elderly were sent to dig trenches, while Red Army units were mobilized chaotically, often without engaging in combat. Added to this confusion were logistical errors and the absence of a coherent chain of command. Voroshilov, lacking modern preparation, opted to create rear battalions and popular militias, armed with hunting rifles, improvised explosives, and even swords removed from museums. Basic needs for artillery and ammunition remained unmet. Added to this was his decision to block a food convoy sent by the Ministry of Trade, fearing that accepting aid could be interpreted as a sign of weakness. The reserves were redirected and never reached their destination. Failures in military leadership were visible. Militias, composed of teenagers, fought without real preparation, while commanders lacked clear instructions. Civilian evacuations were carried out without coordination. Those who managed to enter the city did not receive ration cards, leaving them outside the food distribution system. The situation deteriorated rapidly. On August 8th, German forces crossed the Luga line, and on the 20th of the same month they took Chudovo. 10 days later, Morgues fell, cutting the last railway lines to Leningrad. On September 8th, the occupation of Shlisselburg sealed the encirclement. The city was completely isolated by land. From the north, Finnish forces, allied with the Axis, reinforced the blockade. That same day, an aerial bombardment devastated the WWII food warehouses, destroying thousands of tons of reserves. The flames were visible from every corner of the city. Rations were reduced to a minimum, and an unprecedented famine began. The air and land offensive combined with a strategy of extermination by starvation. The Nazi high command decided not to occupy Leningrad, but to let it die slowly. Food supplies to occupied areas were suspended, and orders were given to shoot any civilian attempting to flee. Meanwhile, Stalin, aware of the gravity of the situation, replaced Voroshilov with Georgy Zhukov on September 11th. The change was preceded by a report highlighting the tactical deficiencies of the previous command: inefficient use of artillery, chaotic deployment, and reliance on militias without resources. Voroshilov left the city by plane that same night. Despite the disaster, he was neither tried nor punished, owing to his closeness to Stalin. It was not the first time Voroshilov had shown such failings. During the Winter War against Finland, initiated in 1939, his management had already proven ineffective. He ignored logistical warnings and denied modern weaponry to the troops, rejecting proposals for strategic maneuvers. When the front stalled, he was replaced by Timoshenko, who managed to break Finnish resistance and force an armistice. However, Voroshilov organized celebrations in Leningrad, rewarding units that had not even participated in the combat. After that conflict, he attributed the errors to erroneous reports, which he himself had ignored. His role during the military purges of the 1930s, where he supported the elimination of professional commanders like Marshal Tukhachevsky, had contributed to the deterioration of the Red Army's capability. The lack of competent officers in 1941 was one of the causes of the rapid disorganization in the face of the German advance. The combination of misguided decisions, logistical negligence, and internal purges resulted in a weak and improvised defense at a crucial moment. The consequences were immediate. The city was isolated, without reserves, without adequate evacuation, and with thousands of civilians trapped. The siege of Leningrad began under the worst possible conditions. Kniazev and the preceding days: disorder, silence, and waiting. On Sunday, June 22, 1941, the routine in Leningrad was abruptly interrupted. While the population enjoyed a peaceful summer morning, the news arrived that would change their lives. Germany had begun the invasion of the Soviet Union. The confirmation by radio later that day was an unexpected blow. Georgy Kniazev, director of the Academy of Sciences Archive, recalled reading about archaeological findings in Samarkand when he received the news. Immediately, he began recording the events in a personal diary. The atmosphere in the city remained apparently unchanged during the first few days. Many thought the war would not reach Leningrad. Elena Skriabina was preparing a family outing to Peterhof when her husband, after hearing the rumors, asked her to stay home. Joseph Finkelstein, an engineer, observed the crowd's reaction upon hearing the official declaration in front of a public loudspeaker. On June 27th, the population was called upon to build fortifications. Men and women between 16 and 50 years old were organized to dig trenches around the city. Shifts were assigned according to occupation. Elena Kochina, a laboratory worker, mentioned the enthusiastic participation of women in defensive tasks. The arrival of Kliment Voroshilov on July 11th intensified the work. Workdays were extended to 12 hours without breaks, under strenuous conditions. Simultaneously, the urban landscape began to change. Sandbags were placed in front of emblematic buildings, statues were covered, and paper crosses were put on windows. According to Lydia Ginsburg, these measures gave the city a sense of security in the face of the imminent. The authorities, however, kept information under control. Radios were confiscated, and only broadcasts via loudspeakers were permitted. When Pskov fell on July 8th, the press mentioned it 4 days later. The omissions generated rumors that spread quickly. Skepticism was reflected in phrases like, "We're winning, but they keep advancing." Censorship unleashed a climate of suspicion. Tram stops were not announced, and the police received constant reports about alleged spies. Kochina recounted incidents of discrimination based on clothing. Tension also affected family ties. The debate over evacuating children divided many families. Official speeches did not inspire confidence. Zhdanov's appearance was met with indifference, and Stalin's radio address on July 3rd seemed bland to many. Repression remained active. People were detained without explanation. In this context, the government formed a people's army composed of volunteers and workers. Finkelstein enlisted early, although in many factories employees were pressured to enroll. The created units lacked training and resources. In mid-July, with German forces reaching the Luga, some were sent to the front and decimated. Meanwhile, on July 18th, the food rationing system was established. Maps were also withdrawn, and the evacuation of the Hermitage began. The scarcity of information caused uncertainty. Ryabinkin, a teenager, started keeping a notebook where he recorded his routine. His mother warned him that if she disappeared, his aunt would take care of him. That same week, enemy reconnaissance flights began. Although there were no direct bombings, alarms were constant. On August 10th, a massive evacuation of women and children began. However, the trains with evacuees were sent towards threatened areas. Some convoys were bombed, as in Lichkovo. Fedorov recounted scenes of devastation. Many mothers undertook journeys to rescue their children, with no guarantee of finding them alive. On August 25th, the last train service from Leningrad was interrupted. The city became completely isolated. Knyazov harshly criticized the authorities in his diary. Food reserves were insufficient. People went into the countryside searching for any edible resource. Zhdanov issued appeals invoking the patriotism of the inhabitants. On September 1st, composer Dmitry Shostakovich announced a new work. His statement was received with emotion. At the same time, defenses were improvised: barricades, repurposed cannons, rudimentary structures. Ryabinkin wrote a secret plan to stop the enemy, a sign of the widespread anxiety. On September 8th, the siege began. Communications were cut. Rations decreased to critical levels. Air raids became more frequent. More than 15,000 incendiary bombs fell that month. The population spoke of strange lights in the sky and saboteurs. The city entered a new phase, marked by the daily struggle for survival. With the arrival of the cold, desperation increased. Commerce closed, and people exchanged belongings for food. Knyazov, facing an empty bread pantry, installed a hook on the ceiling, reflecting a final decision. Thus began the harshest period for Leningrad. The siege sought not only to suffocate the city militarily, but also to break it spiritually. The inhabitants faced a threat that went beyond the visible enemy. Hunger, fear, and disinformation became daily foes. Cursed ground, the Neva trap. On September 11, 1941, Georgy Zhukov arrived in Leningrad after a risky flight escorted by Soviet fighter bombers. He carried a direct order from Stalin placing him in charge of the city's defense, displacing Kliment Voroshilov. As soon as he landed, he revoked a measure previously approved by Zhdanov and Voroshilov, the scuttling of the Baltic fleet. For Zhukov, keeping the ships was essential to the defensive strategy. Weeks earlier, the evacuation from Tallinn to Kronstadt had ended in tragedy. The fleet, composed of warships, smaller vessels and civilian ships packed with refugees, was targeted by German air attacks and mines. More than 50 vessels were lost, and it is estimated that over 17,000 people died during the operation. Zhukov ordered the deactivation of explosive charges placed on the ships and redistributed them as floating artillery platforms. In this way, the 338 cannons of the fleet were incorporated as part of the city's coastal defense. Upon assuming command, he reorganized the military structure. He divided Leningrad into 6 defensive sectors, reinforced the lines with fortifications, and deployed anti-tank weaponry. He denounced the disorder in the previous command and eliminated measures he considered useless, such as wooden tanks used as decoys. To impose order, he established strict discipline. Those who abandoned their positions without authorization would be executed. Despite indications that the enemy would not launch a frontal assault, Zhukov clung to that hypothesis. He ignored reports pointing to a German strategy of prolonged siege. In this context, he forced the Eighth Army to launch an offensive from Oranienbaum, despite its fragile state. The operation failed, resulting in a high number of casualties. He also ordered the reinforcement of Oreshek Island, east of Lake Ladoga. During the daytime crossing to the island, German aviation decimated the first contingents. Of the 200 soldiers in the first wave, only a dozen managed to reach their destination. In another attempt, Zhukov pushed for the crossing of the Neva to take positions on the eastern bank, near Nevskaya Dubrovka. At that point, the Nevsky bridgehead was formed. Soviet soldiers crossed the river on improvised rafts under constant enemy artillery fire. Losses were devastating from the very first days. Although they managed to establish themselves briefly on the other side of the Neva, the offensive did not consolidate. The 54th Army under Kulik's command did not react in time, and the Germans took advantage to strengthen their positions. Enemy fire on the bridgehead was relentless. The strip became overcrowded with brigades and divisions that were decimated within weeks. Some formations were reduced to fewer than 200 men. Many of the combatants were teenagers without military experience. Nicknamed Nevsky Piatachok, that patch of land suffered thousands of daily bombardments. On October 5th, Stalin summoned Zhukov to Moscow. Zhdanov was left in charge of the local command. Offensives from Nevsky continued, without achieving results. Casualties mounted while other strategic routes, like Schlisselburg, remained insufficiently reinforced. The pressure of the siege became increasingly unbearable. Supplies failed, and morale collapsed. Executions for desertion increased. Soldiers' diaries recounted scenes of hunger, theft, and frustration with stagnant leadership. Rations were reduced to minimal levels. On October 20th, another assault was attempted to break the siege. Despite deploying thousands of men and almost 100 tanks, German artillery easily contained the advance. Despite the setback, Stalin demanded new offensives. With the arrival of winter, the situation worsened. Crossing the Neva became impossible due to the ice, and malnutrition intensified. Zhdanov pushed for the construction of a supply line across Lake Ladoga. However, attacks from Nevsky continued, without significant progress. Even attempts were made to reinforce the bridgehead with light tanks, which proved ineffective. The few that arrived were disabled or destroyed. As a last resort, radio operators were sent to maintain communication with the trapped troops. On November 26th, a final counter-offensive was launched. Without support or adequate weaponry, thousands of soldiers were sent into open ground. The massacre was inevitable. In response, scapegoats were sought. Colonel Frolov and Commissar Ivanov, who refused to execute a suicidal order, were tried and executed. Meanwhile, the civilian population suffered under constant bombardment. Escape attempts were repelled by orders from the German High Command. Food reserves were running out. Frozen ground was dug up in search of roots or tubers. In some sectors, cases of cannibalism were documented. From their positions, German artillery shelled the city without pause. Schools, hospitals, and homes were frequent targets. German soldiers were instructed to shoot civilians attempting to escape. On December 13th, the German High Command concluded that resistance would not last much longer. The hope was that the population would slowly succumb to starvation. The Nevsky bridgehead became a symbol of Soviet sacrifice. Thousands of lives were lost in futile attempts to break the siege. The pressure on the city did not relent. That piece of land, saturated with bodies and fire, condensed the drama of Leningrad, a fierce struggle with no immediate horizon, where every attempt to resist cost hundreds of lives, and still was not enough to open a breathing space. Leningrad frozen, the minimum ration. During December 1941, Axel Reichart, a scientist at the Zoological Institute of Leningrad, remained focused on his work on Soviet fauna, despite the hunger weakening him day by day. A specialist in Coleoptera, he had dedicated his life to the study of insects. Although his health deteriorated, he persisted in his research, meticulously recording every observation. He had been arrested in 1938 by the NKVD, along with other colleagues with foreign names, although he was released a year later and was able to resume his work. 50 years old when the siege began, Reichart alternated his tasks between protecting his collection, keeping watch from the Institute's roof, and continuing to write. He maintained a rigorous work system with notebooks and India ink, even noting interruptions caused by shells. In December, he wrote, "If I do not die of hunger, I will succeed." Shortly thereafter, he was found dead in his office, neatly dressed. The city suffered from growing famine. Elena Kochina, married shortly before the invasion, recounted in her diary the changes the siege wrought on her husband, Dima. Initially affectionate, he began to show signs of moral deterioration. He stole food, attacked a child, and developed strategies to pilfer bread. Elena watched him with fear, as his decline reflected the decomposition of the city. In her writings, she described scenes of looting, violence, and desperation. German reports confirmed that the population no longer responded to artillery alarms and that people were collapsing from hunger in the streets. Mutual aid became unviable due to general exhaustion. The command of the 18th Army forbade its troops from speaking about the famine to prevent a moral crisis. However, many soldiers knew what was happening. Amid the suffering, theatres offered an emotional refuge. The musical comedy theatre became a space of escape. Despite extreme conditions, actors and musicians continued to perform. Nikolai Rudashevsky and Tamara Salnikova related how they lived and slept in the theatre to keep performing. Even when an actor died during intermission, the rest of the cast decided to continue for the audience. The Institute of Plant Genetics was also a scene of resistance. Its employees protected a vast collection of seeds and tubers. Although dying of hunger, they did not touch the reserves. They thought of future generations. In the streets, acts of solidarity alternated with those of selfishness and desperation. Zoya Taratinova, a teenager, managed to protect a bread shipment with the help of the crowd. The gift of a plate of wheat from acquaintances encouraged Andrei Krukhov's family, but there were also thefts, looting, and growing indifference to the suffering of others. The Hermitage Museum, although impoverished, remained active thanks to the energy of a naval generator. Alexander Boldyrev, one of its workers, described the scarcity of food and fuel. The cold became unbearable, and food reserves were insufficient. Personal records of citizens like Yuri Bodunov, Yuri Ryabinkin, and Elena Skryabina attest to an alarming physical deterioration. By mid-January, deaths reached astronomical figures. The NKVD reported cases of cannibalism, bread theft, and widespread desperation. Cannibalism was tried by military tribunals, and sentences were carried out. Popkov, mayor of Leningrad, tried to reassure the population with optimistic speeches, but discontent grew. Many officials had evacuated, and inequalities in food distribution were notorious. Exclusive dining halls like Canteen No. 12, intended for high-ranking officials, received generous supplies, while the rest of the population starved. Despite everything, gestures of compassion multiplied. Neighborhood collectives organized to survive together, sharing resources and supporting each other. Alexandra Shustova described how her group stayed united by cooking and helping one another. Anatoly Molchanov highlighted the importance of having leaders within these collectives who looked after everyone's morale. At the Institute of Architecture, Nikolai Baranov participated in a meeting where the future of Leningrad was discussed as an act of symbolic resistance. Hopes for reconstruction kept the spirit of some alive. Meanwhile, the Germans analyzed the possibility of using toxic gas, but lacked the necessary weaponry. Starvation remained their primary strategy. By the end of January, reports indicated that the dead were accumulating in courtyards and streets. The ice prevented burial, and they were left piled up. In hospitals like the Alexandrovskaya, more than 1,000 corpses accumulated. Children were particularly vulnerable. Smallpox added to the causes of death. Authorities increased rations, but distribution was so deficient that bread did not arrive. The city was going through its worst moment. Amid this tragedy, stories of humanity continued to emerge. A woman shared bread with a fainted man. Children were saved by mothers who sacrificed what little they had. Neighborhood collectives cared for their members, but there were also those who morally collapsed. An architect expelled his wife and daughter to keep their rations. Faina Viktorovna, a midwife, accepted food in exchange for performing abortions, hoarded provisions, and refused to help hungry neighbors. At the end of January, the last pumping station stopped working. The population drew water from the river, forming human chains. Although authorities announced new rations, they knew they could not deliver. The city had entered its most critical phase. Leningrad, though on the verge of collapse, still resisted. Black January, the cruelest month of the siege. On January 28, 1942, under the constant roar of German artillery, Nikolai Gorshkov described the desperate situation in Leningrad in his diary. The temperature had dropped to 45 degrees below zero with a relentless northeast wind. German bombings caused constant fires in the city, aggravated by faulty stoves improperly installed in buildings. Numerous tall buildings burned uncontrollably. The fire department was inoperative. The lack of water made any attempt at extinguishing impossible. Gorshkov related that, hopeless of preserving their homes, neighbors threw belongings from windows hoping to salvage something. Vladimir Zant, a 14-year-old boy, illustrated the siege. He drew a house destroyed by a shell, citizens drawing water from the Neva River, and a burning building on Ligovsky Avenue. Under this last image, he wrote, "Nobody can flee." The fires spread for days. Dmitry Likachev recalled that improvised stoves frequently caused tragedies, and weakened residents could barely react. On one occasion, an incendiary bomb pierced a building on Suvorovsky Avenue, collapsing the staircase and igniting the fire. Trapped, some chose to jump from the windows. The promise to increase the bread ration turned cruel. On the day scheduled for its implementation, bakeries closed due to lack of water. Elena Kochina recounted how those who could still walk formed a human chain from the Neva to a bakery, passing buckets of icy water. Despite the effort, barely any bread was produced. Vera Inba wrote anxiously, "There is no water. If the bakeries close, even for a single day, what will happen?" On the 26th, Inba confirmed the continued lack of supplies. Kochina also noted that food supply had ceased completely. People fainted or died in the queues. Still, the impulse to help persisted. Ludmila Anapova described how neighbors lowered sleds and buckets to the Neva to haul water. Among corpses dressed or covered with blankets, the efforts were in vain. That night, Elena Skryabina wrote, "No bakery met its quota." On January 27th, Alexander Boldyrev expressed that his only struggle was for survival. The Fontanka River was contaminated, and there were no cigarettes left. The crisis revealed the darkest side of people. Lydia Okapkina had moved with her children to an acquaintance's home. Soon after, the hostess consumed their rations immediately and ended up stealing the little food she had. Finally, she confessed to having lost her ration cards. Okapkina returned to her dwelling. With her children, they burned old furniture and searched for coal. Overcome by hunger, she knelt to pray, asking for a quick joint death. The next day, a Red Army soldier knocked on her door with a package sent by her husband. It contained rice, semolina, and crackers. That day, fires continued. Bread still did not arrive. By 3 in the morning, endless queues were already forming. Many did not go to the factories. In the canteens, soup ran out quickly. The streets were deserted, except for the crowds in front of shops. Without electricity, workers waited uselessly for its return. Gorshkov pointed out that several sectors burned uncontrollably. Rumors of attacks and cannibalism multiplied. The authorities were paralyzed. Igor Chaiko noted that the city had reached a breaking point. The new ration cards, scheduled for the end of the month, had not been distributed, which proved fatal for many. Vasily Vladimirov, 17 years old, began his diary after the death of his brother Boris. He described a city without light, without heating, without water. They used glue and boiled leather as food. Broken windows were covered with cardboard. Upon going out, they encountered frozen bodies. It was estimated that up to 20,000 people died daily. The diet, lacking fat, devastated health. Boris, after receiving a piece of bread from a doctor, could not digest it. The soup was water with flour. On January 27th, there was no bread. On the 28th, his mother spent 19 hours in line without getting food. On the 29th, the thermometer read -41 degrees Celsius. The soup only contained glue and rice, the tea, salted water. Without firewood, Vladimirov wrote, "We are going to die of hunger and cold." That same day, Gary Rostov, 9 years old, drew a knife cutting bread. Below he wrote, "I am very hungry." Vera Inba observed that all fences had been torn down for firewood. Only century-old birches and linden trees remained standing. A secret NKVD report confirmed that the increase in the bread ration did not improve the situation. The lack of water, electricity and fuel undermined morale. Censorship picked up increasingly severe criticisms. An intercepted letter read, "Leningrad is now a mortuary. The streets are avenues of the dead. Everything is paralyzed." Between January 25th and February 15th, postal shipments from Leningrad were suspended to prevent the truth from reaching the outside world. In the bread lines, comments were bitter. At the Smolny, Leaders had hot food, electricity and heating. A baker, Silin, related that officials avoided the queues. Zhdanov was mentioned directly. An accountant from the musical comedy theatre commented, "Zhdanov has chocolate for breakfast in bed while we die of hunger." The leader underlined the sentence and requested punishment for the responsible party. Authorities focused efforts on suppressing dissent. On January 29th, the NKVD reported the arrest of clinic workers accused of spreading information about deaths and diseases. On January 31st, Alexander Boldyrev wrote that his legs weren't responding and that there would be no bread the next day either. Sleds transported several corpses simultaneously. Alexandra Ivanova, after losing her father, 3 nephews and an aunt, took them to the cemetery. She found no coffin and covered her father with a shirt. Igor Chaiko related that bodies, wrapped in colourful fabrics, were deposited in the snow for collection teams to locate them. This harvest of colours became common. Some mothers carried their deceased children in their arms with shattering dignity. Tamara Zaitseva recalled boiling books and chewing belts. In her neighbourhood, a mother devoured her daughter. Mat Sundakov remembered his mother picking up crumbs with her finger on the table. Sofia Buryakova visited her recovering brother daily. On January 30th, he asked her not to miss a visit, but her son, on leave from the front, arrived unexpectedly, and she didn't go. Upon returning, she learned her brother had died. She suspected he was murdered for his ration cards. On January 31st, Igor Chaiko lay in bed, strengthless. A friend walked kilometers in the snow to bring him food. Health personnel continued visiting homes searching for orphaned children. A doctor found 3 bodies in an icy room, a woman, a teenager, and a baby. A little girl, the sole survivor, tried to revive her mother with a towel. On February 4th, Mikhail Nasirev wrote that the city had lost all semblance of civilization. The dead accumulated, and food was obtained through unspeakable means. Even so, he tried to save a fainted man. At the hospital, he witnessed the horror, gardens and corridors filled with corpses, insensitive staff. He concluded in his diary, "Today I understood the meaning of the word horror. The thin line, distribution, escape and ruin." In the early days of December 1942, a provisional road was marked out on the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga, intended to connect Leningrad with the territory controlled by the rest of the Soviet Union. This emergency route, enabled by the Red Army, allowed the transport of essential supplies into the city and the partial exit of civilians. Although later remembered as the Road of Life, its initial weeks failed to reverse the food collapse striking the population. Built under extreme temperatures, the route began at railway points near Tikhvin and extended to the port of Osinovets on the western shore of the lake. From there, cargo was transferred to trucks and sleds that crossed the ice towards the besieged city. The inaugural journey proved tragic. 157 vehicles were destroyed by the ice or enemy attacks. Drivers left doors open to escape in case of falling through, which in turn exposed them to aerial bombardments, as they had to keep lights on to navigate in the darkness. As winter progressed, the organization and efficiency of transport improved. By late December, about 4,000 vehicles arrived daily with approximately 700 tons of cargo. In January, the daily volume of supplies doubled. Vera Rogova, responsible for regulating traffic on the ice, recounted that there were no shelters for personnel and shifts were continuous. Despite rules requiring distance between vehicles, many advanced in groups to ensure the maximum possible deliveries. Ivan Krylov, in charge of loading on the eastern shore of the lake, described entire days unloading sacks of grain, sugar and fuel drums under constant fire. According to his words, they knew each unloaded cargo represented a subsistence ration for thousands trapped in Leningrad, where daily bread barely reached 125 grams. Although transport capacity grew, distribution within the city was not equitable. By mid-February, when the route allowed the entry of 3,000 tons daily, complaints persisted about food diversion. In the queues, it was murmured that party warehouses were stocked while the population continued to collapse. Some state workers were accused of secretly hoarding provisions. Civilian evacuation, planned since early December, had been postponed. The initial idea was to remove 5,000 people per day starting December 10th, but after a meeting with Stalin, Zhdanov suspended the operation, arguing that a mass exodus could be interpreted as a sign of weakness. Only in February 1943, with the military offensive stalled and temperatures stabilized, was the population transfer resumed. Pavel Luknitsky, an official chronicler, accompanied one of the first outbound convoys. Unlike the vehicles entering with discipline, those departing carried desperate passengers, many without formal authorization. In stretches farthest from military control, some civilians offered food or warm clothing in exchange for a place on the trucks. Others attempted to advance on foot, exposing themselves to hidden crevasses or mines camouflaged in the snow, placed by the Luftwaffe. The difference in conditions among evacuees also generated tension. While some were transported in heated vehicles, most traveled in open trucks. Elena Skriabina recounted how, during the journey, several passengers died from hypothermia. In one incident, a child lost consciousness watching others eat without sharing any food. Elena Kochina noted hearing logistics system employees boast about available reserves, oblivious to the suffering they witnessed. At medical points along the route, volunteers like Olga Melnikova attended to malnourished women and children arriving too weak to cry. Many miners fell from vehicles at the slightest jolt, and some were found already lifeless. Survivors were offered hot drinks, blankets, and basic assistance. Sometimes a little tea and a few crackers were enough to temporarily revive them. Trains leaving from the eastern shore transported both the living and the dead. Medics knocked on compartments to remove corpses before restarting the journey. Despite the risks, thousands registered daily hoping to be evacuated. It wasn't until the second half of February that improvements in internal distribution began to be observed. The appearance of sausages and processed meat in certain establishments sought to calm discontent. However, criticism did not cease. Some party members expressed disagreement with the management. Artist Ivan Gruzdev denounced the concealment of food, and painter Anna Ostromova publicly expressed her indignation at the distribution priorities. In contrast to these complaints, actions emerged reflecting the desire to resist. Anatoly Molchanov mentioned that, even amidst the cold and scarcity, some suddenly regained strength. Olga Simanovskaya, a teacher in a children's shelter, created reading and poetry routines that the children began to follow enthusiastically. Despite exhaustion, the repetition of these habits gave them an illusion of normalcy. Dr. Mikhail Chernorutsky, assisting the most critical patients, noticed that those who maintained positive thoughts or clung to small hopes showed greater resilience. An example was the case of Tanya Utkina, a girl who managed to overcome the brink of collapse after clinging to the memory of her younger sister. From radio studios under minimal conditions, Olga Bergholz recited poems with a weakened but firm voice. Although her husband had died of starvation, she continued broadcasting. Her words, often the only message of solace for many, kept the emotional connection between citizens alive. Young Elena Martilla, an artist in recovery, decided to paint a self-portrait at a moment of extreme weakness. She considered her effort an affirmation of life. A few days later, she began showing signs of improvement. Others, like Alexandra Ivanova, focused their energy on helping sick neighbors. Andrei Krukov, a survivor of a failed evacuation, dedicated himself to rebuilding what little remained of his home to protect his family. Peter Tsvetkov, a 5-year-old boy, received a piece of bread with sugar from his mother. Although he couldn't chew, the sweetness of the food sparked a reaction in him. That simple act symbolized what thousands of inhabitants tried daily, to resist a little longer. While German artillery did not cease and supplies remained insufficient, the city stood firm. The road over the ice was not a guaranteed salvation, but it offered a possibility. Around it, acts of courage, sacrifice, and decision were articulated, interwoven in the complex tapestry of survival that defined that winter. Between March and August 1942, cleanup, sanitary control, and cultural revival. One frigid morning in late February 1942, Lydia Okhapkina walked along the Neva embankment, pushing through wind-driven snow. What was once a bustling city now showed semi-destroyed buildings, with broken windows and black holes like empty sockets. Some buildings, despite being partially collapsed, were still inhabited. In one of them, a fire had been active for 3 days, supposedly caused by an improvised stove. Around it were piled furniture and personal belongings rescued from the fire. Nevsky Prospect, Leningrad's main artery, appeared covered in snow, with hardly any pedestrians or transport. Buildings were damaged and boarded up, while trolleybuses and trams lay inert under a white layer. Elena Martilla described this scene as absolute silence, interrupted only by the distant pulse of a metronome coming from loudspeakers hung on corners. That constant sound evoked the vital rhythm of a city refusing to surrender. Red Army soldier Sergei Milyaev, visiting Leningrad, encountered a city draped in mourning, dark streets, visible corpses and penetrating silence. However, he noticed in the consumed faces of the citizens an incorruptible determination. Despite the harrowing stories he heard, he felt Leningrad was fighting a battle to stay alive. On February 18th, Nikolai Gorshkov recorded the emergence of digestive diseases, including chronic diarrhea, among an already weakened population. Cases of typhus were reported, exacerbated by the lack of hygiene and soap, whose distribution had been suspended that month. Quarantine was decreed due to the risk of spread. Shortly after, a dysentery epidemic appeared. Nadia Makarova, in a distressed letter, told of losing her mother and 2 of her children in a few days. She described the ravages of a disease caused by the combination of extreme malnutrition and water contamination, worsened after the collapse of the sewage system. Anna Ostromova estimated daily deaths between 20,000 and 25,000. Olga Freidenberg summarized it as an uncontrollable wave of death. Slavik, a young man, wrote to his aunt relating how infections were now added to the bombs and hunger. Dmitry Likachev's father died on March 2nd. While transporting his body, he witnessed trucks full of frozen corpses, some standing as if petrified in mid-action. Mass graves multiplied, dug by excavators. Makarova managed to have her mother buried next to her children, paying with the little food she had. The grave diggers, exhausted and overwhelmed, threw bodies carelessly. Ivan Yakushin saw his uncle's corpse removed from a makeshift coffin and thrown onto a pile of dead. Sofia Buryakova observed workers stepping on bodies while depositing new deceased, and upon leaving the cemetery, she encountered the corpse of a man frozen with a cigarette in his mouth, pointing towards the graves. Suffering drove some to the brink of madness. Makarova feared losing all her children and felt at her limit. Cannibalism resurfaced. Valentina Rothman, 12 years old, found mutilated bodies when removing them from abandoned dwellings. Some were thrown from windows as they couldn't be carried down, breaking upon impact with the frozen ground. Viktor Kozlov related that severed human limbs, torn breasts and remains appeared in garbage cans. Natalia Stroganova, 7 years old, remembered seeing a sled loaded with tied bodies, limbs protruding. Since October of the previous year, German commanders had warned of the epidemic risk and decided to besiege the city until it died. On February 18th, the appearance of smallpox was confirmed, something Gorshkov also noted that same day. Hitler commented privately about cannibalism in Leningrad, and German propaganda even claimed its inhabitants fed on jelly made from glue and human flesh. The city, according to them, was lost. Evgeny Monyushko warned that with the thaw, excrement and corpses buried under the snow would spread diseases. Vera Inba wrote about the fear of typhus spreading and the possibility of the entire city succumbing. On March 8th, a city cleanup campaign began, led by women. By March 15th, over 100,000 people had joined the effort. A journalist described how neighbors brought brooms, shovels, or children's sleds to remove trash. Tikhonov compared this feat to the labors of Hercules. Kira Petrovskaya recalled how, even with weakened bodies, thousands joined to clear ice, snow, and debris. Elena Martilla tried to clear a square with other teenagers without adequate tools. Initial skepticism gave way to widespread commitment. The authorities, however, responded harshly. An elderly woman was arrested for not showing up on the second day. Anger against officials grew. Lydia Targa, director of a ballet academy, wore luxury clothes obtained by bartering food. Threatening to take away ration cards, she forced her hungry students to work in the cleanup. On March 26th, an official statement indicated that less than half of the buildings had been cleared. Dmitry Likachev noted that inhabitants were so exhausted they could barely lift a shovel. Visiting the Smolny, he perceived the contrast. Well-fed officials in an environment smelling of hot food. Despite everything, the atmosphere began to change. "We declare war on trash," said Martilla. The public library remained open. Its employees, armed with burning pieces of wood, searched for books among piles. Readers requested works on varied topics from diseases to classic literature. Martilla illustrated the faces of those still reading and dedicated her work to the librarians. The Hermitage Museum also participated in the cleanup. Its head of security, Pavel Gubchevsky, organized crews of elderly women who, despite their age, removed rubble and guarded the museum halls. Seeing them work, others joined. On March 27th, Inba wrote about the immensity of the task. Piles of garbage, blocks of ice, and frozen waters covered the city. Nevertheless, a new collective spirit was perceived. Fima Ozakin, 11 years old, proudly recounted cleaning a snowdrift with a friend. Vera Inba was moved seeing the cleared sidewalk on the embankments. A starving woman contemplated the asphalt she had just uncovered and after a pause resumed her task. The transformation also extended to the sanitary sphere, vaccination campaigns, distribution of vitamin C obtained from pines, and on April 15th, the return of the trams. In the hospital where Vera Pavlova worked, patients, hearing a tram bell, rose with effort, celebrating the sign of life. For many, that sound marked the beginning of a new stage. That same day, Vladimir Zant stopped including a noose in his drawings of the city. Now he showed trams in motion and wrote, "The city is reviving." A German prisoner confessed he lost faith in Hitler when he heard the tram running on April 15th, but soldiers at the front still faced extreme conditions. At the Neva headwaters, a small unit had resisted since winter, isolated and without communication. Alexander Sokolov was chosen to cross the river and request reinforcements. Although he succeeded, he received orders to resist until May. On April 27th, they were dislodged by the enemy. Potatoes and cabbages were planted on the field of Mars. The population gathered wild herbs. Igor Chaiko described children sharing clumps through fences. The city awoke from a winter nightmare. Veronika Nikandorova went out with her brother to find food among mined fields. They gathered carrots and cabbages, which they took home to prepare soup. Alexander Fadiv found children who neither spoke nor played. In a nursery, he saw a girl save part of her bread to remember her mother. Tanya Savicheva, in her diary, noted the deaths of all her relatives. At the end, she wrote, "Only Tanya remains." Elena Martilla knew her. Tanya clung to a withered plant that reminded her of her family. She swayed beside it, trapped in a trance. Nina Zakharina, a teacher, began noticing a different atmosphere. On May 6th, she cooked dandelions, and on the 10th, she celebrated the regularity of the trams. Likachev planted radishes in an overturned table by the window. Although bombings continued, life resumed its course. Zakharina evacuated children across Lake Ladoga, but saw an explosion hit the boat. Hats floated to the shore. On May 29th, amidst shells, spring persisted. The next day, women sat on benches or opened windows. Some applied makeup. Inba saw lemon trees bloom in the botanical garden. The persistent stench was softened by their fragrance. In June, Igor Chaiko found hope in nature. He gathered herbs and flowers, feeling nourished by the earth. Alexandra Amosova also felt the urge to kiss the ground that sustained them. Culture transformed into a lifeline. People traded food for concert tickets. Galina Vishnevskaya sang at the opera, describing the audience in coats, their breath visible in the cold hall. Igor Chaiko enjoyed concerts. Babinskaya celebrated the reopening of cinemas and music gardens. Pavel Gubchevsky, previously indifferent, now valued the effort behind each performance. In July, Peter Kotelnikov visited a painting exhibition. He marveled that even besieged, they organized art shows. Maria Udina highlighted the bond between artist and audience as an antidote to horror. Alexandra Ivanova, after losing her family, led a choir of 40 voices for the soldiers. Lydia Targa, in contrast, organized a concert for the elite, forcing sick dancers to perform. In a hospital, Alochka Ivanova, 9 years old, danced The Dying Swan for the wounded. Without music, she hummed the melody while staggering. With effort, she finished her performance and fainted amidst applause. In March, Karl Eliasberg decided to perform Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in the besieged city. With starving musicians, he began rehearsals. Reinforcements were needed, even from the front. With discipline and tenacity, he assembled an orchestra capable of rehearsing at the Philharmonic. On August 9th, it was presented to an audience of soldiers and civilians. The symphony also sounded over the radio. Listeners in the trenches and at home were moved. The hall rose to applaud. Eliasberg, emotional, received a bouquet from a little girl. The city once again resisted through music. From defense to advance, Govorov and the opening of the Ladoga corridor. In early April 1942, the Leningrad front received Lieutenant General Leonid Govorov as its new commander. His appointment drew attention, as he did not stand out for grand gestures or an intimidating presence. Reserved in character and with sparse mannerisms, he often uttered the word loafer almost like a tick, a habit inherited from his days in the Tsarist army. Although he could seem distant, he showed constant concern for his troops. At 45 years old and with a distinguished career in artillery, Govorov had participated in the Russian Civil War, first on the white side and then the red, winning the Order of the Red Banner for his defense in Crimea. His experience was consolidated in the Winter War against Finland, where he led the bombardments that broke the Mannerheim Line, and later in the defense of Moscow. Despite his technical profile, he did not join the Communist Party until mid-1942. His arrival coincided with a desperate situation. Soviet forces in Leningrad suffered from hunger, disease, and very low morale. Meanwhile, the enemy strengthened. Army Group North, now under the command of General Georg Kuchler, prepared a major air offensive. On April 5th, the anniversary of Alexander Nevsky's victory, the Luftwaffe launched a massive attack called Operation Ice Strike. Meticulous rehearsals had been conducted to identify Soviet ships trapped in the ice and their exact positions. Despite Govorov's efforts to reinforce defenses, the offensive caused severe damage to the Baltic Fleet. Almost simultaneously, a Soviet offensive in Lyuben failed, leaving the Second Shock Army exposed, which was surrounded and annihilated. After the capture of its commander, Andrei Vlasov, Hitler promoted Kuchler to the rank of Field Marshal. Following that disaster, Govorov concluded that the high number of Soviet casualties resulted from poorly coordinated attacks without sufficient artillery support. In response, he increased ammunition reserves, improved observation points, and tripled the allocation of shells per battery. He also firmly opposed restarting offensives like the one at the Nevsky bridgehead, which he considered an unnecessary sacrifice. On August 9th, before the concert of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony at the Philharmonic, Govorov ordered an intense bombardment to neutralize German artillery and prevent interruptions. He arranged for the music to be broadcast to both Soviet soldiers and enemy troops. Meanwhile, in the southern part of the Eastern Front, the fall of Sevastopol prompted Erich von Manstein to prepare an offensive against Leningrad. His plan was to penetrate from the south, encircle the city, and isolate it completely. The attack was planned for August. Faced with this risk, the Soviet High Command approved an alternative strategy, launching an offensive east of Lake Ladoga to break the siege. Govorov would attack from the Neva, while another front would attack from the east. On August 27th, as Manstein surveyed the city from the south, Soviet artillery opened fire, initiating the operation. Soviet attacks from both sides of the corridor gained ground, reducing the distance between their forces to less than 7 kilometers. Alarmed, Hitler ordered Manstein to assume full control of the sector and cancelled the offensive on Leningrad. In September, clashes continued in swampy terrain. Although the Wehrmacht resisted, the direct threat to the city had dissipated. Govorov consolidated his approach based on high-precision artillery to weaken the enemy. One of the most notable advances was the use of decoys. Soviet batteries fired with the aim of provoking enemy fire to locate their positions. One such operation, led by Lieutenant Amelichev in the Pulkovo Heights, uncovered 16 German batteries. In parallel, the Battle of Stalingrad captured national attention. On November 19th, the Soviet counterattack encircled the German Sixth Army. The news was received with enthusiasm in Leningrad, revitalizing the population's morale. Manstein's transfer south to relieve Stalingrad eased the pressure on Leningrad. The energy supply improved thanks to an oil pipeline laid under Lake Ladoga. In December, citizens remembered the horror of the previous year with renewed hope. At the musical comedy theatre, the play The WWII was performed. Despite an attack during the performance, actors and audience decided to continue, in a symbolic gesture of resistance. By early January 1943, Govorov had the plan ready to break the siege, Operation Spark. Troops were trained on a special field replicating enemy terrain. Artillery was fine-tuned on specific firing ranges. On January 12th, the offensive began with a massive bombardment, followed by Soviet troops crossing the Neva. Tanks were sent over reinforced wooden rails, and 2 bridgeheads were established. Although the Germans resisted from the Sinyavino heights, the Soviets managed to advance. Georgy Zhukov, now a marshal, tried to pressure commanders to attack the hills head-on. General Simonyak refused to execute orders he considered suicidal and was supported by Govorov, who chose to flank the enemy positions. On January 15th, ski brigades attacked Schlisselburg from the east. Fighting intensified in Worker Colony No. 5. Finally, on January 18th, Soviet forces linked up the 2 fronts. That night, the radio announced the end of the siege. Leningrad celebrated in the streets. Poems, speeches, and music filled the city. 17 months had passed, but the breaking of the blockade marked a turning point. However, the battle for Leningrad was not yet over. The opened gap did not mean definitive liberation, but for the first time, the city breathed. The end of the siege and the beginning of reconstruction. On January 18, 1943, Soviet troops succeeded in breaking the isolation that for months had separated Leningrad from the rest of the country. This operation, the result of the Red Army's effort, represented a long-awaited victory for the population. Emotion was widespread, although the fighting did not cease. German forces still occupied key positions around the city. The offensive failed to completely expel the enemy. Hitler's troops maintained control of an extensive defensive perimeter known as the Northern Rampart, stretching from Pulkovo to Novgorod. This line, over 150 kilometers long, was reinforced with mines, ditches and fortifications. Overcoming it would require considerable resources and personnel. Meanwhile, the Red Army focused on consolidating the recovered access. In less than 20 days, a road and a railway line crossing the Neva River via a makeshift bridge were built, allowing provisions to enter. Despite bombings and constant enemy surveillance, trains and trucks operating mostly at night managed to supply the city. The first railway convoy reached Leningrad on February 6th. However, the route remained extremely vulnerable. The bridge over the Neva was a constant target for German aviation. On February 9th, a group of Soviet airmen successfully defended the structure from an enemy bomber attack. By Stalin's order, censorship was intensified. Public references to the suffering caused by the siege, especially hunger, were forbidden. Poet Olga Bergholz, invited to speak on the radio from Moscow, was warned to focus on the population's heroism and avoid any mention of hunger. Despite restrictions, an atmosphere of recovery was perceived. With the arrival of spring, signs of hope emerged. On March 3rd, Igor Chaiko wrote that although the war continued, he felt he could overcome any adversity. Even under the threat of shells, inhabitants resumed their routines. In a concert interrupted by anti-aircraft fire, no one left the hall. Urban gardens regained importance. Children collaborated in cultivation. Inna Bityugova, a young drawing enthusiast, created illustrated stories where personified vegetables helped the needy and encouraged soldiers. The Soviet advance during the summer of 1943 bolstered morale. With the German retreat from Ukraine and southern Russia, the perception of a definitive change grew. In Leningrad, cats were reintroduced to control the rat plague, a symbol of recovery. Some of these animals were transported by train from other regions. Nevertheless, German artillery intensified attacks against civilian targets, including tram stops. Human losses and destruction were significant. Amid the pain, the population strengthened community ties. Many young people recorded in diaries and letters the sense of unity the siege had generated. Resistance was perceived as part of the country's collective destiny. To completely liberate the city, General Govorov designed a multiple offensive. Units were mobilized towards the southern and western bridgeheads. Taking advantage of the solid ground in winter, the attack was planned for the early months of 1944. Simultaneously, an official narrative centered on unity, and Govorov's leadership was crafted. Anything not coinciding with this vision was censored. Diaries and plays were confiscated. Some authors were arrested. On November 5, 1943, preparations began. Under Govorov's direct supervision, large quantities of heavy artillery, mortars and rockets were assembled. Kukla, for his part, ordered the evacuation of the civilian population east of his defensive line, anticipating a retreat. When the ground hardened with frost in January 1944, the attack order was given. On January 15th, a massive bombardment began, the largest recorded in the city up to that point. The intensity of the fire made it clear that the final operation had begun. In the following days, Soviet troops recaptured numerous localities, including Pushkin and Pavlovsk. The overwhelmed German forces began their withdrawal. On January 27th, Leningrad was officially liberated after more than 2 years of siege. The city celebrated with fireworks and artillery salvos. The lights of Soviet ships illuminated the monuments. Despite the cold, citizens took to the streets, moved by the end of the blockade. Life slowly began to normalize. For many, walking without fear of shells was a new experience. Children played in the street. Rooms with sunny windows were used again. Simultaneously, the official version of the siege solidified, a united city, led by its authorities. Individual pain and internal divisions were omitted. Criticism was swiftly suppressed. During the siege, the regime repressed all dissent. In a particularly extensive operation, the author of pamphlets signed "The Rebel" was sought. In December 1943, Sergei Lushkov, a local worker, was arrested and confessed to writing them all. Even foreign observers noted the differences between the common population and party officials. While many survived on minimal rations, official circles maintained certain privileges. This heightened mistrust towards leaders. Despite everything, the city moved forward. In March 1944, upon capturing a German map, it was discovered that schools, hospitals and museums were among their targets. In July, the Red Army reached the former border with Finland. That same month, Govorov was promoted to Marshal of the Soviet Union. After the Finnish withdrawal, some inhabitants returned to their homes. Many found ruins invaded by vegetation. Nostalgia was inevitable. German prisoners of war were employed in reconstruction tasks. In still deserted sectors, the city seemed suspended between memory and recovery. Each evening, prisoners were escorted through the main streets. The population watched them in silence. There were no insults or aggression. That collective silence expressed something deeper, a mixture of grief, resignation, and the certainty that no revenge could compensate for what had been endured. Thus, the citizens of Leningrad began to rebuild. Through shared suffering and persistence, the city embarked on the path back to life, leaving behind the darkest chapter of its recent history. The siege of Leningrad was a prolonged operation of total blockade, in which German forces sought to subdue the city through hunger and isolation. For almost 900 days, the population faced extreme temperatures, lack of food, diseases, bombings, and cuts in basic services. The state failed to guarantee security or supplies, and the population had to adapt to survive. The records used in this documentary show daily life during the siege. Difficult facts are not hidden. There was desperation, theft, violence, and death by starvation. There were also gestures of support among neighbors, collective work and organizational actions to maintain certain basic functions in the neighborhoods, such as food distribution, street cleaning, and childcare. The city's resistance was not the result of a centralized strategy, but the effort of thousands of people who continued doing everything possible to stay alive. Recovery was not immediate. Many areas remained in ruins, and a large part of the population was physically and mentally affected. After the liberation, a process of reconstruction began, marked by silence about what was experienced, censorship, and the dissemination of an official version that left out many experiences. This documentary has sought to show the facts from different points of view, based on testimonies and documents from the era, without omitting the real effects of the siege on the people who lived through it.